Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of Japanese literature and culture before 1600. I am, as always, your host, your dancer, your literomancer. Nah, I don't know where I was going with that. Nicholas Tyson. So this week, we're going to be talking a little bit about Esoteric Buddhism, which is a fun topic that maybe even I don't understand perfectly, but I do my best. So I hope you guys do your best as well. And we're also going to be talking about the second, not the second, but sort of like the next major imperial poetry anthology, the Kokin Wakashu, or the Kokinshu, as it's usually called. But first, in this video, we're going to be talking about some esoteric Buddhism. So let's share our usual outline. Get that up. All right. So at first I want to talk a little bit about sort of Buddhism in general, because I don't know, you guys may or may not be familiar with sort of the big issues. So I want to talk a little bit about these two terms that are on here. One is Nirvana, it's right there. The other is Samsara. So in thinking about the type of Buddhism that was practiced in Japan, it was primarily this word right here, esoteric in nature. The other type of Buddhism, in fact, the much more common type of Buddhism, is what is generally known as exoteric Buddhism. So what is the major difference? So the primary difference has to deal with essentially when you can achieve so-called enlightenment or nirvana. In fact, I'm going to prefer using the term nirvana because it doesn't really mean enlightenment, even though that's usually the way it's referred to or translated into English. So the idea in esoteric Buddhism, amongst a whole host of other things, is that nirvana is actually something you can achieve in this lifetime, as opposed to something that is achieved as the culmination of what is sometimes called a karmic cycle, or just your karma, generally speaking. So for those of you who are not familiar with like Indian philosophical practices, karma is this notion that like the choices you make and the behaviors you engage in, they kind of store up sometimes moral, but sometimes just like ethical consequences that then get realized later in life. Oftentimes this gets sort of bastardized as like, oh, well, if something bad is happening to you now, then you must have done something bad in a past life. That's not really what karma is. Karma is sort of like the total store of like suffering or negative consequences. And but it's not just negative consequences. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. The total store of like things that are going to happen to you, and they are realized as a result of like whatever. Yeah, it's sort of like you do things, and then sometimes the consequences aren't resolved immediately. They get sort of stored up for later, and then you see those consequences, either positive or negative, later in life, or maybe even in another life, because we're talking about cycles of rebirth here. So in its original incarnation, Buddhism thought that like for any given individual, the sort of nirvana, or freedom from the sort of that cycle of suffering and pain and all that, that comes at the end of like once your karma has been fully played out. Whereas esoteric Buddhism, which by the way at the time that it's introduced in Japan was kind of a new thing in India and was still being developed both in India and in China. So it's like, this is like the fashionable new Buddhism as opposed to the stodgy old Buddhism. Another major difference. So actually let's talk a little bit about Nirvana and Samsara. So I have Samsara as, this phrase here is going to be very important for particularly reading religious texts. Whenever a writer in pre-modern Japan says this world, they're not just talking about sort of reality or the world we live in. They're also metaphorically referring to this concept of samsara. What is samsara? Well, it's like, how should I explain? So in the earlier sort of Hindu cosmology, there's this idea that individual souls transmigrate, meaning you are constantly being born, like your soul is constantly being born, reborn, and reborn, and reborn over and over and over and over and over again. So samsara is sort of the suffering that you experience as a result of that constant cycle of rebirth. And so the ultimate goal of all Buddhist practice is to free yourself and actually everyone else from that cycle of constant rebirth and the suffering that comes along with it. So then at least according to exoteric Buddhism, the opposite of that, sort of the polar opposite of that, in fact, is this thing known as nirvana. Nirvana, the word in Sanskrit literally means something like blowing out or quenching, in the way that you would like blow out a candle or you would quench a fire. And what is quenched in this case is sort of the fire, the raging torment of like the suffering that you experience in life. So nirvana is not so much enlightenment as freedom, really, a freedom from this cycle of suffering and rebirth that everyone experiences. Now, what's different between esoteric Buddhism also like has these concepts as well. But rather than thinking of those two things, nirvana and samsara, as a hard and fast distinction, like they're mutually distinguishable, not distinguishable, they don't overlap. Esoteric Buddhism actually sees it as kind of a continuum. You can be more or less in this world, and you can be more or less free from the suffering that attends to it. So the last major distinction, I mean, there are other distinctions. If you want to get into like, you know, the ins and outs of all forms of Buddhism, there are plenty of religious studies courses that you can take. This is not a course about Buddhism. This is a course about Japanese literature and culture. And this is just sort of what you need to know for the purposes of understanding those things. The other major distinction that we have here is, so exoteric Buddhism sees what you have to do in order to achieve nirvana as fundamentally a renunciation. In other words, all of the things that are bad in your life or that cause bad things to happen in your life, so, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you're supposed to renounce them. You're supposed to just completely give them up, live a life of like quiet contemplation and peace. And through renouncing the like vile pleasures of the world, you will eventually achieve this state of freedom from the suffering that they cause. Esoteric Buddhism, on the other hand, sees this as a process of transformation. In other words, it doesn't necessarily, you can be a sinner, it's fine. And in fact, in many ways, they see sinning as sort of like one stage along the path towards nirvana. So there isn't this denigration of the passions. There is less of an emphasis on like absolute truth. And it's not that necessarily that sort of esoteric Buddhism is relativistic. And if in many ways, it actually rejects the whole idea that there are relative and objective truths. In other words, there is a sort of non-duality at play here, and that's really important to esoteric Buddhism. So in this, actually, I'm going to skip a little bit. I'm going to go to the Buddha nature. Probably Buddha nature should have been B, and ritual as vehicle should have been C. But really fundamental to esoteric Buddhism is this concept known as the Buddha nature. So what is the Buddha nature? That is this assumption that any living creature, as they are at this moment in time, are capable of achieving like full Buddhahood. Like you literally a minute from now could turn into another Buddha. Why is this important? Because it's central to this notion that nirvana is achievable in this lifetime. You are always capable of achieving freedom from samsara at any given moment. And all you actually need to do is engage in certain ritualistic practices, and I'll get to that in a second, that allow you to sort of move along the continuum, to move along the progression towards becoming free from the cycle of suffering. Whereas in exoteric Buddhism, the freedom is achieved in stages, but they're more kind of like aha, like you just get there. And like I said, you get there as a result of finally like purging yourself of a karma cycle, not by doing particular things. It's more, I mean, you do also do things, but the idea is to sort of like get rid of your full store of karma, not necessarily like engage in particular practices that have particular means towards particular ends. And so in esoteric Buddhism, you have this idea that ritual functions as it's usually translated as vehicle. Means is probably another way of saying this. So there are a lot of ritualistic practices, like the creation of mandalas. The primary texts that are used in esoteric Buddhism are called tantras. So it's this word here. The word tantra literally means a sort of like a weave, like a woven pattern like this, or it can also refer to a loom, the device by which you create a weave or a woven fabric. Why is this concept of like the tantra important for esoteric Buddhism? So the idea is that like you can take all of these several threads and you can weave them together into a pattern, and by creating that pattern, a greater picture or a greater thing will emerge, and that greater thing is ultimately your enlightenment or your freedom from suffering and rebirth. So from this perspective, religious texts aren't necessarily sources of dogma. They are means towards an end. In other words, you read particular, scriptural texts, you try to understand them as a means towards moving closer to enlightenment. Because again, we're thinking of this as a continuum rather than as sort of like fixed states. Also really important to esoteric Buddhism is like the way in which initiation works. So I don't know if this is necessarily I don't know, this is maybe this is a contradiction, maybe it's not. But at the same time that sort of esoteric Buddhism posits that like anyone at any point can achieve nirvana through these particular means or vehicles, it also keeps all of that hidden. Like there's a, how should I put this? Like the teachings themselves are often kept secret. They were very rarely written down and were closely guarded by those who practice them. Part of the reason for this is the emphasis in esoteric Buddhism on the sort of master-pupil relationship. It's that this isn't something you can just do on your own. It's something that you have to be guided through, and that's why degrees of initiation become really important, because you're sort of being moved along the path. It's essentially like Buddhism as like an educational system. First, you have to do first grade Buddhism, you have to do second grade Buddhism, third grade Buddhism, until you eventually get out of elementary school Buddhism, and then you're in junior high Buddhism, and then eventually you get to high school Buddhism. You can go on to college Buddhism. Some people go into graduate school Buddhism. It's very much sort of a staged, like a slow, steady progression, and in each point along the way, you have to be sort of guided through the process. So how did esoteric Buddhism come to Japan? Well, it primarily came to Japan through, let's see, I got a picture of him somewhere. Here he is, Kobo Daishi himself, Kukai. Actually, let's zoom this out. So this is a portrait of Kukai from the Art Institute of Chicago. And that is my cat whining. If you guys heard that. So here you see Kukai. He's got his Buddhist robes on. He's holding his Buddhist stuff. There's his prayer beads, and he was bald apparently, and he's sitting on this chair, and you got his shoes, and you got an urn over here. Anyway, that's Kukai. So Kukai was originally kind of a nobody. He was a Japanese aristocrat, who, as not a terribly young man, kind of in his see how old, he 805, so he would have been like 29. Yeah, he would have been about 29 when he traveled to China to study, but also later in life he was a civil servant who actually was responsible for a number of public works projects. So this is kind of weird. Like he was both a guy who helped build bridges. Literally, that's not a metaphor. He literally built bridges, but also sort of built bridges in the metaphorical sense between this world and the next, so to speak. But this knowledge came to him primarily through his study at monasteries in China, where esoteric Buddhism was at that time all the rage. Like I said, this was very fashionable in the early 9th century, late 8th, early 9th centuries. As a result of his studies, he was himself initiated and sort of became his particular master's favorite pupil. And then when he came back to Japan, he introduced a far more systematized Buddhist practice. And he founded one of the first sort of schools of Buddhism in Japan, known as Shingon, which is the Japanese word for a mantra, or a truth, so to speak, a real truth. And it was through this school and also through another school founded by a guy named Saicho called the Tendai School that ultimately became more prominent than Shingon. But Kukai was the first guy to come back and really sort of turn Buddhism into a complete structured institution. Remember when we talked about Nada Buddhism? Nada Buddhism was something that sort of got mapped onto religious practices that already existed in Japan. It was more bureaucratic. It wasn't quite as systematized as what Kukai brought back. So, what were Kukai? So we talked generally about esoteric Buddhism, and Kukai was a proponent of all those things. But let's look more specifically at the sorts of things that Kukai himself talked about. So I had you guys do a fairly difficult reading, and I apologize for that. If you do your best to get through it, maybe even watch this first before going back through and trying to read it again, so that way you can kind of notice the themes that I'm pointing out here. But part of the first piece that I had you guys read is the sort of like question and answer session. And at one point, Kukai responds to a hypothetical question posed to him. It sort of lays out the problem as we really kind of want to talk to. It's brass tacks here. What is the difference between the two teachings, exoteric and esoteric? And he says in this incredibly cryptic way, but I'll break this down for you. The Buddha's celestial responsive bodies for the sake of others and the Buddha's human responsive body give teachings in accord with the capacities of beings that we know as exoteric. The teaching by the Dharma nature Buddha for its own sake is the realm of the wisdom of inner realization that we know as esoteric. You're all following along here? Okay, so let's break this down. First, he mentions the Buddha's celestial responsive bodies for the sake of others and the Buddha's human response. Okay, so we got two kinds of Buddha here. We have a celestial Buddha, sometimes referred to as the cosmic Buddha. And then you have Buddha's human responsive body. So that is the real historic figure, often known as Shakyamuni, or the dude we know as Siddhartha Gautama. The actual in other words, the historical Buddha, the person who actually lived and first, promulgated these teachings. So you can think of these two. Go back and think of the way. Remember how I talked about the Nara Buddha, the Buddha at Todaiji, the great Buddha, and how you had a big central Buddha, and then you had little Buddhas all surrounding it. So in many ways, that's a way you can think of the relationship between these two things, sort of the celestial Buddha and the responsive body. So the celestial Buddha is this idea of like Buddhahood that sort of interpenetrates the entire universe. So the bodies for the sake of others, this is this idea of sort of like the Buddha or Buddhahood, really, because it's not a specific creature, it's more a state of being. So Buddha-ness, if you will, sort of interpenetrating the entire universe and sort of filling it with the possibility of eventually like achieving freedom from all the crap that makes our lives so difficult. But then what we see as individual historical individuals was the historical Buddha, the Buddha's human responsive body. And that person, that human being, the body of Buddha-ness, so to speak, gave us teachings, as he says, in accord with the capacities of beings. In other words, he gave us teachings about Buddha-ness, about Buddhahood, that were suited to our understanding. That we know as exoteric. Okay, so that's exoteric Buddhism. You sort of this distinction between Buddha-ness as like a cosmic principle, and then you have the Buddha, the historical person, who gave us a way to try and understand that thing that is actually ineffable, but is suited to our mode of understanding. So that's exoteric. Now, the teaching by the Dharma nature Buddha for its own sake. So this thing, the Buddha for its own sake, is the realm of the wisdom of inner realization that we know as exoteric. So focus less. I'm not going to talk about the concept of the Buddha for its own sake, because again, this is kind of out there. Really what you want to focus on here is this notion of the realm of wisdom of inner realization. So instead of sort of like looking through teachings as a means towards an end in which sort of like a cosmic principle, that is to say our karma, finally like plays itself out and we become one with the universe, so to speak. In other words, it's exoteric. It's X because it's sort of directed out into the universe and out into the cosmos, out into other things. This one is esoteric because it is sort of focused inward. And in many ways, esoteric Buddhism is a kind of like, I don't know, it's like a self-help philosophy. I'm sorry, that's really flippant. But it is kind of like a self-help philosophy. It is a way of sort of thinking about yourself, how to improve yourself, and how to make this person who you are now into this thing that you ultimately want to become, which is to say free from pain and suffering and all, the crap we have to deal with. The other thing that I want you to take away from these two Kukai readings, where is this, page 60? Okay. Is this notion of like the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. This is not just Kukai. This is important for really the entirety of esoteric Buddhism. And I'm going to read a really long passage. Beginning right here with I'm basically going to go through all of this. Within the exoteric teachings, in other words, that other one, the Buddha, the bodies for others, and the historical Buddha, the four elements are regarded as being non-sentient. The four elements, like earth, wind, fire, water, literally what we know as sort of the four elements, are regarded as being non-sentient. But in the esoteric teachings, it is said that these make up the fundamental vow of the symbolic Buddha body to attain enlightenment. There's a footnote for this, and I think the footnote is actually kind of helpful, which is to say that the cosmos is a body of symbolic representation where all phenomena signify aspects of Buddha's awakening. So all phenomena, all things that you see in the world as realized, have a symbolic relationship to the Buddha itself. In other words, even mundane things, in other words, there's this, it's almost an allegorical way of looking at reality. The mundane things you see in day-to-day life, they have their mundane meaning, like, right here. Like, this is a mug that contains my delicious tea, but also sort of the mug as a vessel that contains containment. In other words, there's this idea of like a principle that you can kind of like see beyond the thing itself, but the thing itself is also representative of that. And so he's saying that there's a fundamental, deeper meaning in all things. Although the four elements are inseparable from the mind, although mind and forms are different, their basic nature is the same. In other words, there's a non-distinction between your consciousnness, the thing going on inside here, and the stuff that we are. There is a non-duality, a non-distinction. I mentioned that before. That non-distinction is important. Neither precludes or obstructs the other. In other words, bodies, and so your body and your mind, they are not in the way of each other, and they're not sort of like in the Platonic sense, like one is not a prison for the other, but there is no real meaningful difference between them. Wisdom consciousness is the same. I'm going to skip over a little bit. Although subject and object, so we're starting here now. I'm going to do this. What? Come on, let's highlight it. There we go. I think there's an important concept to be found here. Although subject and object appear to be two distinct entities. So subject and object, you can think of this in like grammatical terms. So like the subject of a sentence, like, I'm talking in this microphone. So I'm talking words, I'm saying words. So there's me, I, the subject of that sentence, talking words, and words are the object. So there's this distinction that is being made there between sort of the I, this guy, and the words, almost as if the words are sort of like out here. But if you think about it for a second, the words emanate from me, and in many ways, at least from your perspective as a student taking this class, are synonymous with me, with my ideas, with my teaching, with the way I present it. In other words, what this particular type of Buddhist practice is trying to get you to see is that there is actually a non-distinction between me as the speaker and the things that I say. And in other words, you're trying to get to a point where you can understand that those things are not actually distinct. Things are just as they are. What could there be that creates? Terms such as subject and object are all, quote, esoteric words. Grasping onto the ordinary, shallow, incomplete meanings, one ought not make a myriad of empty speculations. It is in this way that we can understand how all the, quote, bodies that arise from the six great elements, whose essential nature is the phenomenal world of reality, interpenetrate and do not obstruct one another. Let's look at that again. So the bodies, so the phenomenal world of reality interpenetrate and do not obstruct one another. So going back to this principle of sort of like the interconnectedness of all things. Perpetually residing without change is the same as residing in ultimate reality. So this esoteric principle, this idea that like you as you are now plus the you as you will be or could be in some hypothetical future when you attain Buddhahood or become a bodhisattva or whatever, those are actually not distinct. They are connected to one another. Again, there's this idea of a continuum. Your body, you who you are in samsara, in the sort of this cycle of rebirth, is fundamentally connected to and dependent upon who you will be as an enlightened individual or as someone who has achieved nirvana. Now I realize that sort of the way this is, I mean, these are sort of religious / philosophical texts. They're going to be hard to decipher. But that's really what Kukai is trying to say here, that there is, again, the non-distinction between subject and object, the non-distinction between you and the things that emanate from you, or in many ways between you and the world. There's a non-distinction, like, in other words, you as the subject of your life and the world is sort of the object in which it takes place. That is actually, there is a non-distinction there. The only distinction that is made is essentially a verbal one, or one that sort of is dependent upon like the grammar of our language. And part of the sort of practice of these esoteric rituals is to try and get you past to the point where you have to understand the world, understand the world in that dualistic way. So that's really kind of what I want you to get out of the Kukai reading, and also sort of this general conception of esoteric Buddhism. This is going to become really, really important for basically every like you really need to understand this, because it'll be important for every single, actually I can probably stop sharing this. This will be really important for pretty much every single type of Buddhism you see in Japan from this point on. Part of the reason for this is that the type of Buddhism that was most prominent in the Indian subcontinent sort of melded better with sort of pre-existing religious and philosophical traditions, particularly in the Hindu tradition, where they didn't really necessarily have a problem with the whole cycle of birth and rebirth. And in fact, any given individual is not really that important. The problem in Japanese society is because they had this pre-existing system of animism and ancestor worship. It's kind of the two sort of contradict each other. You can't both have like historical figures becoming a kind of kami that you then revere and like ask for, I guess you could say, help in this world, and at the same time assume that they're being, reborn over and over and over again. So the type of Buddhism in which that is less important, this idea of sort of the karmic cycle as the thing that ultimately realizes your nirvana, your freedom, had greater appeal in Japan precisely because it was sort of more amenable to existing religious traditions. And you'll see that play out in, the way in which Zen is adopted, Pure Land Buddhism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's it for now. In our next video, I'll be talking about the Kokinshu. So for now, take a break, go get something to drink, and I'll be back in, the next video.